Montana Territory, 1878. The last snowfall of winter blanketed the valley in a fresh coat of white, erasing the mud and decay of early spring. Grace Ellis stood at her cabin window, watching the delicate flakes swirl like dancers across her property. 24 years of life had taught her that beauty and hardship were often two sides of the same coin, especially in this wild corner of the Montana Territory. She tucked a strand of honey-blonde hair behind her ear and adjusted the faded blue calico dress that had once belonged to her mother. The dress hung loosely on her slender frame, a reminder of the meals she'd skipped to make her supplies last through the unforgiving winter. Her reflection in the window glass showed a face too young to bear the title widow, yet here she was, 3 years since John's passing, still carrying on alone. Survival is what matters now, not companionship, Grace whispered to herself, a mantra she'd repeated countless times since burying her husband. She had convinced herself that loneliness was preferable to loss, that independence was strength, and that opening her heart again would only invite more pain. The wilderness had taken John during a hunting trip, his body found frozen beneath a fallen pine after a sudden blizzard. Grace had learned her lesson. The frontier would claim anyone foolish enough to believe in forever. Her small homestead sat isolated at the edge of Whitefish Creek, 5 miles from the growing settlement of Pine Ridge. The cabin John had built with his own hands stood as both shelter and memorial. 20 acres of land that should have supported a family now served as a monument to a widow's stubborn persistence. Outside, her 2 milk cows and small garden were all that kept her from destitution. Inside, memories of a brief marriage haunted the silence. As the afternoon light faded, the snowfall intensified. Wind howled around the cabin corners, finding every crack and crevice to whistle through. Grace stoked the fire and hung her small kettle over the flames, preparing a meager stew from the last of her winter vegetables. The potatoes had begun to sprout and the carrots had grown soft, but they would sustain her for another day. The sound came faintly at first, a rhythmic crunch of snow beneath hooves, growing steadily louder as it approached her cabin. Grace tensed, reaching for the rifle that always stood by the door. Visitors were rare enough in good weather. In a snowstorm, they were usually desperate or dangerous. The knock, when it came, was weak, 3 soft taps barely audible above the wind. Grace lifted the rifle, keeping it low but ready as she cracked open the door. "Beg your pardon, ma'am," came a strained voice. "My horse threw a shoe 'bout 2 miles back. I've been walking, looking for shelter." The figure before her was nearly blue with cold, a young man no older than 26, his broad shoulders hunched against the biting wind. His once fine coat was crusted with snow, and his hat was pulled low over eyes the color of summer sky. Despite the cold reddening his clean-shaven face, she could see he was handsome, with strong features and a gentle mouth now trembling from the cold. "Please," he added, glancing nervously at her rifle, "just until the storm passes." Grace's instinct was to send him away. Strangers meant danger, independence meant safety. But something in his eyes, perhaps the naked vulnerability, so unlike the hardened frontier men she typically encountered, made her hesitate. "Where you headed?" she asked, keeping the door barely wide enough to speak through. "Circle R Ranch, north of here, Mr. Richardson's place. I'm one of his men." His teeth chattered as he spoke. "Name's Gabriel Rowe, most folk call me Gabe." The Circle R was one of the largest cattle operations in the territory, nearly 30 miles north. The young man before her would never make it there in this storm. With reluctance born of hard-learned caution, Grace stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in then, but leave your gun belt by the door." Relief washed over his face as he stumbled inside, fingers numb as he fumbled with his gun belt. "Thank you kindly, ma'am, I won't be any trouble." Grace closed the door against the howling wind and watched as the young cowboy stood awkwardly just inside, melting snow forming puddles around his boots. His clothes were quality, not the costume of some would-be gunslinger, but practical garments meant for working cattle. His holster held a simple Colt, well-maintained but not flashy. "You can put your coat by the fire to dry," she instructed, keeping her distance. "There's stew in the pot." "I couldn't take your food, ma'am," he protested, though his eyes darted hungrily toward the kettle. "It's not charity," Grace replied, more sharply than she intended. "It's common decency, and my name is Grace Ellis, not ma'am." Something in her tone made him look at her more closely, his eyes registering the wedding band she still wore, the masculine construction of the cabin, the solitary place setting at the small table. Understanding dawned in his expression, but mercifully he asked no questions. "Thank you, Mrs. Ellis, I'm much obliged." As she ladled the humble stew into a bowl, Grace watched Gabe from the corner of her eye. He moved with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his body, but there was a gentleness to him that seemed at odds with the rough world of ranch hands and cattle drives. He kept his hat in his hands, turning it nervously, and maintained a respectful distance. "How long have you worked for the Circle R?" she asked, placing the bowl on the table and gesturing for him to sit. Gabe removed his gloves and warmed his hands briefly before the fire. "Going on 3 years now," he answered, settling cautiously into the chair. "Started as a wrangler, worked my way up to Mr. Richardson's right hand for cattle purchases." Grace nodded, serving herself a much smaller portion. "Long way from the ranch, what brings you this direction?" "Mr. Richardson sent me to Helena to secure grazing rights on some government land. Was on my way back when the storm hit." He took a spoonful of stew and couldn't suppress a small sound of appreciation. "This is mighty fine, Mrs. Ellis." "It's nothing special," she replied, though she felt an unexpected flicker of pride at his approval. "Just what was left of my winter stores." They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the howling wind, the crackling fire, and the occasional clink of spoons against bowls. Grace found herself studying him when he wasn't looking, the way his lashes cast shadows on his cheeks in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the calluses on hands that had clearly known hard work. "You're alone out here?" Gabe finally asked, his voice gentle with concern rather than prying curiosity. Grace stiffened. "I manage fine." "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise," he said quickly. It's a hard country for anyone to face alone." "I'm not looking for a ranch hand or a husband, if that's what you're wondering," Grace said, her tone cooler than the storm outside. Gabe's eyes widened and a flush crept up his neck. "No ma'am, Mrs. Ellis, I wasn't suggesting, I only meant," he trailed off, clearly flustered. Something about his embarrassment softened her. "I'm sorry, that was unkind. I'm not accustomed to company." "No apology needed," he said, recovering his composure. "I spoke out of turn." The howling of the wind intensified, rattling the shutters. Grace rose to check that they were secure, aware of Gabe watching her movements. "Storm's getting worse," she observed. "You'll have to stay the night, you can have the chair by the fire." "I couldn't put you out." "It's that or freeze to death trying to find your way in the dark," Grace interrupted. "And I'd rather not have that on my conscience." Gabe nodded, accepting her logic. "Then I'm grateful for the chair." As the evening wore on, Grace found herself speaking more than she had in months. Gabe asked thoughtful questions about her garden, her livestock, the repairs the cabin needed. He listened with genuine interest to her answers, offering occasional suggestions drawn from his ranch experience. Not once did he comment on her solitary state or question her abilities. When Grace finally retreated to her small bedchamber, she was surprised to realize the tightness in her chest, the constant companion of loneliness, had eased somewhat. She fell asleep to the murmur of the fire and the occasional creak of the chair as Gabe shifted his tall frame. Morning brought clarity and sunshine, the storm having blown itself out overnight. Grace emerged from her bedroom to find Gabe already awake, the fire built up and a pot of coffee brewing. "Hope you don't mind," he said, gesturing to the coffee. "Thought I might repay your kindness with breakfast, at least." "You found the coffee beans," Grace noted, impressed despite herself. Few men she'd known would have thought to prepare morning coffee. "My mother taught me it's the first courtesy of the day," he replied with a small smile. She had strong opinions about hospitality. As they shared a breakfast of coffee and the last of Grace's biscuits, Gabe seemed in no hurry to depart. When Grace raised her eyebrows questioningly, he explained, "I noticed your north fence line is down in spots, and that shutter needs fixing before the next storm. Thought I might help with that before I head on if you'd allow it." Grace's first instinct was refusal. Accepting help meant acknowledging weakness, creating obligation. "That's not necessary." "It is to me," Gabe said simply. "You took in a stranger, fed him your supplies, gave him shelter. Where I come from, debts get paid." There was no condescension in his tone, only a straightforward frontier code that Grace understood well. John had lived by similar principles. "Very well," she conceded. "There are tools in the line too." Gabe spent the morning repairing her fence, his movements efficient and practiced. Grace worked in her garden, turning the soil for spring planting, but found her attention repeatedly drawn to the tall figure working methodically along her property line. There was something compelling about his quiet competence, the way he approached each task with care rather than haste. By midday, Gabe had repaired the fence and fixed the troublesome shutter. When Grace offered him the last of her dried venison for a midday meal, he accepted with thanks but insisted on sharing it equally. "I should be on my way," he said finally, rising from the table. "Mr. Richardson will be wondering what delayed me." Grace walked with him to the barn where he'd sheltered overnight. A beautiful chestnut gelding greeted Gabe with a soft nickering, clearly relieved at his master's return. "This is Rusty," Gabe introduced the horse as if presenting an old friend. "Best cow horse in the territory, though he's got a tendency to throw shoes at the worst possible moments." "He's magnificent," Grace admitted, admiring the animal's strong lines and intelligent eyes. "He is that," Gabe stroked the horse's neck with obvious affection, "and stubborn as the day is long." As Gabe saddled the gelding and prepared to depart, an awkward silence fell between them. Grace was surprised to find herself reluctant to see him go, this stranger who had somehow breached the walls of her solitude, however briefly. "Mrs. Ellis," Gabe said, mounting up and settling his hat firmly on his head. "I won't forget your kindness." "It was nothing," Grace replied automatically, "just what anyone would do." Gabe's expression turned serious. "No, ma'am, not everyone would open their door to a half-frozen stranger." "Not in this country," he tipped his hat. "If you ever need anything at all, the Circle R will be in your debt." With that, he turned his horse northward and rode away, a solitary figure against the snow-covered landscape. Grace stood watching until he disappeared over the rise, telling herself the hollow feeling in her chest was merely the return of her familiar solitude, nothing more. But as she turned back to her empty cabin, she couldn't help wondering if the young cowboy would remember the widow who had fed him once the comfort of the ranch surrounded him again. Such was the way of the frontier, brief encounters, passing kindnesses, then back to the hard business of survival. "It doesn't matter," she told herself firmly, "nothing has changed." Yet something had changed, though Grace would not admit it even to herself. For the first time in 3 years, she had glimpsed a possibility beyond mere survival. And that glimpse, however brief, had awakened something she had believed long dead. 3 weeks passed. Spring arrived in earnest, melting the last of the snow and turning the creek into a roaring torrent of snowmelt from the mountains. Grace threw herself into the work of the season, planting her garden, mending winter damage, preparing for the year ahead. If she occasionally found herself glancing northward, wondering about a certain cowboy with summer sky eyes, she quickly corrected her wandering thoughts. The days grew longer, the sun stronger. Green shoots pushed through the dark soil of her garden rows. Life renewed itself all around her, indifferent to human sorrows or joys. Grace moved through her tasks with the steady rhythm that had sustained her since John's death, finding comfort in routine and exhaustion. Then came the morning when everything changed. Grace was kneeling in her garden, setting out the tender seedlings she'd started indoors when she heard it, the distant rumble of hoofbeats, not one horse but many, approaching from the north. She rose quickly, wiping soil from her hands onto her apron, and reached instinctively for the rifle that was never far from reach. As she stepped around the corner of the cabin, the riders came into view, a line of horsemen cresting the rise, perhaps a dozen in all, driving a small herd of cattle before them. The morning sun glinted off saddle hardware and the occasional rifle barrel. Grace felt her heart hammering. In the 3 years since John's death, she had never faced such a large group of men alone. Her finger tensed on the rifle trigger as the riders approached, but then she saw the lead horseman raise his hand in greeting. The chestnut gelding was unmistakable, as was its rider. "Mrs. Ellis," Gabe called as the group drew closer. "Permission to approach." Grace lowered her rifle slightly, confusion replacing fear. "Mr. Rowe." Gabe rode forward alone, leaving his companions at a respectful distance with the small herd of cattle. Perhaps 20 head, Grace estimated, mostly yearlings with a few older cows among them. "Hope we didn't alarm you, ma'am," Gabe said as he dismounted, his smile warm but slightly nervous. "Should have sent word ahead, but I wanted to surprise you." "Consider me thoroughly surprised," Grace replied, still holding her rifle at the ready. "What is all this?" Gabe removed his hat, revealing hair the color of sun-bleached wheat. "After I got back to the Circle R, I couldn't stop thinking about your kindness," told Mr. Richardson. "How you'd taken me in during the storm probably saved my life." He gestured toward the men and cattle waiting behind him. "He agreed you deserved something more substantial than just my thanks." Grace stared at the cattle, then back at Gabe, struggling to comprehend what was happening. Those are for me. Yes, ma'am, 20 head of prime stock, all bred and ready to calve next month, plus supplies, seed, tools, provisions. He nodded toward the packhorse laden with canvas-wrapped bundles. And these men are here to help get your place ready for the season, if you'll allow it. Grace felt something twist in her chest, pride, suspicion, and beneath it all, a dangerous flicker of hope. I can't accept charity, mister. Roan. It's not charity, Gabe said firmly. It's payment of a debt and an investment in a neighbor. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Mrs. Ellis, Grace, I saw how hard you're working to hold on to this place. There's no shame in accepting help that's honestly offered. Grace studied his face, searching for any trace of condescension or pity, finding none. Only that same straightforward decency she'd glimpsed during the storm. Why would Mr. Richardson do this for a stranger? She asked, still suspicious. Because I asked him to, Gabe answered simply, and because he's a good man who understands the value of neighbors in this country. The Circle R prospers because folks help each other survive. He paused, but if you want us to leave, we will, your land, your choice. Grace looked past him to the men waiting patiently, their faces weather-beaten but open. Several nodded respectfully when they caught her eye. These weren't the desperate drifters or hungry outlaws she had feared might come calling one day. These were working men, ranch hands who understood the brutal arithmetic of frontier survival. And the cattle, 20 head, would transform her struggling homestead into a viable ranch. With calves, she could build a proper herd within a few years. The difference between subsistence and security, between surviving and living. The men can stay until sundown, Grace said finally, lowering her rifle completely. I'll accept the cattle and supplies with thanks to Mr. Richardson, but I won't be beholden. Relief washed over Gabe's features. No one's asking you to be, ma'am, just neighbors helping neighbors. What followed was unlike anything Grace had experienced since John's death. The ranch hands descended on her property with purposeful energy, dividing tasks among themselves with the efficiency of men accustomed to working together. Two began repairing her barn, reinforcing the structure and building new stalls. Others stretched fence line, enclosing a proper pasture for the new cattle. 3 men unloaded the supplies, sacks of grain and flour, coffee beans, sugar, tools, even fabrics and thread. Grace found herself working alongside them, directing their efforts, answering questions about her land. The initial awkwardness of having so many men on her property faded as the day progressed. They were respectful but not distant, treating her as they might any rancher, with deference to her knowledge of her own land. Gabe moved among them, overseeing the work but joining in as needed. He seemed different here, more assured, quietly authoritative. The men clearly respected him, responding to his directions without question. Occasionally, Grace would catch him watching her, a thoughtful expression on his face that he would quickly mask when their eyes met. By mid-afternoon, the transformation was remarkable. Her fences stood straight and strong, her barn ready for the new livestock. The cattle grazed contentedly in the newly enclosed pasture, already making themselves at home. One of the older hands, a grizzled man named Hank, approached Grace as she inspected the repaired corral. Begging your pardon, Mrs. Ellis, but that garden of yours is prime for expanding. With your permission, some of us could break more ground before we leave. Give you room for corn, maybe some wheat. Grace hesitated only briefly before nodding. I'd appreciate that, mister. Hank. The man grinned, revealing a gap where his front teeth should have been. Just Hank, ma'am, and it's no trouble. Young Gabe would have our hides if we didn't do right by you. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, the men gathered their tools and prepared to depart. Grace, overcome by a hospitality she had thought long dormant, insisted they stay for a meal before the long ride back to the Circle R. It's not much. She apologized as she set out a simple stew made from her dwindling supplies, supplemented by the fresh provisions they had brought. It's a feast, ma'am, one of the younger hands assured her, his plate piled high. Best meal I've had since Christmas. The men ate with hearty appreciation, sharing stories of ranch life and cattle drives that made Grace smile despite herself. Their presence filled her small cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth, the warmth of human connection she had denied herself for too long. As they finished eating and the men began filing out to prepare their horses for the ride home, Gabe lingered behind. Will you be all right? He asked quietly. With all this, he gestured toward the window where the new cattle could be seen grazing in the evening light. I managed a farm with my father before I married John, Grace replied, a touch of her old defensiveness returning. I know livestock. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise, Gabe said quickly. It's a lot to take on alone. Grace busied herself gathering plates, avoiding his gaze. I'm not afraid of hard work, mister. Roan. I know that, Gabe stepped closer, his voice dropping, but even the strongest person needs help sometimes. There's no shame in it. Grace looked up then, meeting his eyes. Is that why you brought all this? Because you think I need rescuing. No, Gabe answered, holding her gaze steadily. I brought it because I respect what you're doing here, because I believe in you. The simple sincerity in his words caught Grace off guard. For 3 years she had held the world at a distance, convinced that isolation was the price of independence. Now this man, this stranger who was somehow no longer a stranger, was offering something she had not allowed herself to want. Belief, thank you, she said softly, for all of this. Gabe smiled, the expression transforming his face. I'll come check on the herd in a week or so, if that's agreeable. Some of these cows are close to calving. Grace nodded, feeling strangely reluctant to see him go. That would be helpful. Outside, the men had mounted up and were waiting for their foreman. Gabe paused at the door, turning back to Grace. Mrs. Ellis, Grace, I meant what I said before. If you need anything, send word to the Circle R. I will, Grace promised, and was surprised to realize she meant it. As she stood in her doorway, watching the riders disappear over the ridge, Grace felt the landscape of her life shifting like springtime ground thawing after a hard freeze. The cattle in her pasture, the supplies in her storehouse, the repaired fences and expanded garden, these were tangible changes. But something less tangible had changed as well, something within her that she wasn't yet ready to name. That night, alone in her cabin that somehow no longer felt quite so empty, Grace allowed herself to wonder if perhaps she had been wrong. Perhaps survival alone wasn't enough. Perhaps there was room in this harsh country for something more. True to his word, Gabe returned the following week, riding up to Grace's cabin in the late afternoon. She saw him coming from the garden where she was working and felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. Brushing soil from her hands, she walked out to meet him. Mrs. Ellis, Gabe greeted her, tipping his hat. How are the cattle settling in? Well enough, Grace replied, noticing how the spring sunlight brought out gold highlights in his wheat-colored hair. 2 calved yesterday, healthy heifer calves, both of them. Gabe's face lit with genuine pleasure. That's excellent news. Mind if I take a look at them? They walked together to the pasture, where the small herd grazed contentedly. The new mothers kept their calves close, eyeing Gabe and Grace warily as they approached the fence line. They're good stock, Gabe observed, leaning on the rail. Mr. Richardson's best Hereford Shorthorn cross. Good milkers and hardy. I noticed, Grace said. They're heavier than the milk cows I'm used to, but gentle enough. She paused. Please thank Mr. Richardson again for his generosity. I will, though he considers it a sound investment rather than charity. Gabe glanced at her. He's a practical man, believes in building connections, not just fences. Grace considered this. Is that why you're here, building connections for the Circle R? Something flickered across Gabe's features, uncertainty perhaps. Partly, he admitted. But I also wanted to see how you were faring. The honest answer disarmed her. I'm doing well, Grace said, better than before. They stood in companionable silence, watching the cattle. A soft spring breeze carried the scent of new grass and distant pine. After the long isolation of winter, the world seemed intent on reminding Grace of its beauty. I brought you something, Gabe said suddenly, reaching into his saddlebag. He withdrew a small cloth-wrapped package. It's not much. Grace accepted it cautiously, unwrapping the cloth to find a packet of seeds and a small book. Tomato seeds, she identified, reading the careful handwriting on the paper packet. And what's this? Agricultural Almanac, Gabe explained. Thought it might be useful, has planting charts, weather predictions, that sort of thing. The thoughtfulness of the gift touched Grace more deeply than the cattle had. This wasn't an obligation or a debt paid, this was a personal gesture, one human being to another. Thank you, she said softly. I've been wanting to try tomatoes, but the seeds are hard to come by. These are from my mother's garden in Kansas, Gabe said. She sends me seeds every spring, though I've got no place to plant them at the ranch bunkhouse. Grace looked up at him with new curiosity. You have family in Kansas. My parents and 3 younger sisters, Gabe confirmed. Father has a small farm near Topeka, good land but not enough of it for 5 children to inherit. So I came west. Do you write to them? Grace asked, thinking of her own severed connections to family back east. Every month, Gabe said with a smile. Mother would ride out here and tan my hide herself if I didn't keep in touch. The image made Grace laugh, a sound so unfamiliar to her own ears that she almost startled herself. She sounds formidable. That's one word for her, Gabe agreed, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Loving but fierce, taught all us children that family sticks together no matter the distance. A pang of something like envy passed through Grace. Her own family had disowned her when she married John against their wishes and followed him west. Their letters, infrequent to begin with, had stopped entirely after John's death. Her refusal to return east had been interpreted as final rebellion. You're fortunate, she said simply. Gabe studied her face. Your people aren't out west. No, Grace closed the subject with her tone. Would you like some coffee? I've just brewed a pot. Accepting the change of topic gracefully, Gabe nodded. I'd be much obliged. They settled on the small bench outside Grace's cabin, the spring sun warm enough to make sitting outdoors pleasant. Grace found herself telling Gabe about her plans for the expanded garden, the improvements she hoped to make to the property now that she had resources beyond mere subsistence. I was thinking of hiring help for the harvest, she admitted. With the calves and the garden both needing attention, it might be too much for one person. Sensible decision, Gabe agreed, though finding reliable hands can be challenging. That's my concern, Grace said. As a woman alone, she didn't need to finish the thought. They both understood the vulnerability of her position. Gabe was quiet for a moment. The Circle R could spare a man or two when the time comes. Men I personally vouch for. The offer hung between them, practical yet somehow intimate, an extension of protection without presumption of weakness. I would appreciate that, Grace said finally. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Gabe reluctantly announced he needed to start back to the ranch. Grace walked with him to where his horse waited. I'll come back in 2 weeks, Gabe said as he mounted up. Check on the calves, see how those tomato seeds are coming along. Grace nodded, surprised by how much she was already looking forward to his return. I'll expect you then. Gabe settled his hat and gathered the reins. You know, Mrs. Ellis, a wise woman, once told me that neighbors help each other survive out here. Is that so? Grace raised an eyebrow. Sounds like a practical woman. She is that, Gabe agreed with a small smile. Stubborn too. But I admire her greatly for it. Before Grace could formulate a response, Gabe touched his hat brim in farewell and turned his horse toward the north. She watched him go, a curious lightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the spring air. As the weeks passed, Gabe's visits became a regular fixture in Grace's life. Every 2 weeks, as reliable as the phases of the moon, he would appear on the horizon, always bearing some small gift, coffee beans, a new tool, books to pass the evenings. His practical help around the homestead was valuable, but Grace found herself increasingly looking forward to their conversations even more. Gabe spoke of his life on the Circle R, the rhythms of ranch work, the camaraderie of the bunkhouse. Through his stories, Grace began to feel connected to a world beyond her isolated homestead, the cattle drives and brandings, the town dances she never attended, the changing fortunes of the territory. In turn, Grace gradually revealed pieces of her own story: her childhood in Pennsylvania, her father's work as a schoolteacher, her decision to marry John despite her family's objections. She spoke of their journey west, the dreams they had shared for their homestead, and finally, haltingly, of the blizzard that had taken him from her. We had so little time together, she confessed one evening as they sat by the fire, spring rain drumming softly on the roof. Sometimes I wonder if it was worth the pain of losing him. Gabe was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. My father used to say that love is never wasted, even when it ends in sorrow. He looked up, meeting her eyes. The time you had with John, would you trade it to be spared the grief? Grace considered the question honestly. No, she finally admitted, despite everything, no. That's how you honor him then, Gabe said gently. By knowing the love was worth the cost. His understanding, free from pity or platitudes, eased something in Grace that had been tightly wounded for 3 years. Not healing exactly, but perhaps the beginning of acceptance. As spring blossomed into early summer, Grace's homestead flourished under her care and Gabe's occasional assistance. The cattle grew fat on the rich grass, the garden yielded its first tender vegetables, and the cabin began to feel like a home again rather than a memorial. Grace found herself singing as she worked, a habit she had abandoned after John's death. On a warm June evening, Gabe arrived for his regular visit with news. Pine Ridge is holding a Founders' Day celebration this Saturday, he announced as he helped Grace repair a section of fencing. The whole town turns out music, dancing, food aplenty. Is that so? Grace replied noncommittally, focusing on the fence post she was setting. Thought you might like to attend, Gabe continued, his tone deliberately casual. I'd be pleased to escort you. Grace's hands stilled. In the months since Gabe had first arrived during the snowstorm, their friendship had grown comfortable, built on mutual respect and shared work. But this invitation suggested something more, a step beyond the boundaries of their careful relationship. I haven't been to town in nearly 6 months, she said slowly, and I haven't attended a social gathering since before John died. All the more reason to go, Gabe suggested. Neighbors ought to know each other, especially out here where we all depend on one another sooner or later. Grace drove the fence post into the ground with perhaps more force than necessary. The neighbors know me as the strange widow who keeps to herself. I doubt they're eager for my company. Gabe stopped working, turning to face her directly. Grace, he said quietly, using her first name as he rarely did. You've been alone long enough. There's a whole community just waiting to welcome you if you'll let them. The gentleness in his voice nearly undid her. For 3 years, Grace had told herself that isolation was strength, that needing others was weakness. She had built walls around her heart and called it independence. But Gabe's steady presence in her life had begun to challenge those beliefs, showing her that connections could strengthen rather than diminish. I have nothing suitable to wear, she said finally, the practical objection masking deeper fears. Gabe's face brightened with hope. Is that a yes, then? Grace found herself nodding before she could reconsider. Yes, I'll go. The next day, Grace opened the trunk she had closed 3 years ago after packing away John's clothes. Beneath his things lay her own treasures from a different life, including the blue silk dress she had worn when they were married. It was hopelessly outdated now with its full skirts and tight bodice, but it was the only truly fine garment she possessed. With careful hands, Grace lifted it from the trunk, shaking out the folds. The fabric caught the light, shimmering like water. She had been a different woman when she last wore this dress, younger, full of hope and dreams, unburdened by grief. For a moment she considered returning it to the trunk, along with the memories it evoked. Instead, she carried it to the wash basin and gently cleaned away the dust of years. As she worked, Grace found herself wondering what Gabe would think when he saw her in something other than the practical work dresses she wore daily. The thought brought a flush to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the summer heat. Saturday dawned clear and bright. Grace spent the morning attending to her chores with unusual haste, then bathed in water warmed on the stove and scented with dried lavender she had been saving for a special occasion. She arranged her honey-blonde hair in a simple but elegant knot at the nape of her neck, a few tendrils left loose to soften the effect. When she finally donned the blue silk dress, Grace was startled by her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. The woman who gazed back at her was neither the carefree girl who had first worn this dress nor the hardened widow of recent years, but someone new, someone with shadows in her eyes but also a cautious hope. The sound of hoofbeats announced Gabe's arrival. Grace took a deep breath, smoothed her skirts, and stepped outside. Gabe had clearly made his own preparations for the occasion. His usual work clothes had been replaced by a clean black coat and trousers, his boots polished to a shine. He had trimmed his hair and shaved carefully, emphasizing the strong line of his jaw, but it was his expression as he saw Grace that caught her breath, a look of such open admiration that she felt momentarily unbalanced. Mrs. Ellis, he said, his voice slightly rough, you look beautiful. The simple compliment, spoken with such evident sincerity, warmed Grace from within. Thank you, Mr. Rowe. You're looking quite handsome yourself. Gabe dismounted and led forward not his usual gelding but a gentle mare harnessed to a small buggy. Thought this might be more comfortable than riding astride, he explained. Borrowed it from Mr. Richardson. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Grace deeply. Even in her finest dress, riding side saddle into town would have been uncomfortable at best, humiliating at worst. Yet she hadn't even considered how she would travel. That was very considerate of you, she said as he helped her into the buggy, his hand strong and steady beneath her elbow. The journey to Pine Ridge passed pleasantly, the summer landscape at its most beautiful. Fields of wildflowers stretched to the distant mountains, and the creek sparkled in the sunshine. Grace found herself pointing out landmarks to Gabe, telling him stories about her explorations of the area with John. He loved this valley, she said, gazing at the rolling hills. Said it reminded him of paintings he'd seen of paradise. He chose well, Gabe agreed. It's some of the finest country I've seen, and I've crossed a fair portion of the Western Territories. Have you never thought of claiming land of your own? Grace asked, curious about this man who had become so important to her life yet remained in many ways a mystery. Gabe was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the road ahead. I've thought of it, he admitted, saving what I can from my wages, but good land requires more than just hard work. It takes capital for stock, equipment, a proper house. He glanced at her. I won't settle for less than what could support a family properly. The word family hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Grace looked away, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead, her heart beating a little faster than before. As they approached Pine Ridge, the sounds of the celebration reached them, music, laughter, the happy shouts of children at play. The main street was festooned with bunting and flags, and tables had been set up in the shade of the cottonwood trees that gave the town its name. Nearly everyone in the county seemed to have turned out for the occasion. Grace felt a flutter of anxiety as Gabe helped her down from the buggy. It had been so long since she had been part of any gathering. What if people stared or whispered or worse, treated her with the pitying condescension often reserved for widows? As if sensing her nervousness, Gabe offered his arm. Shall we? The simple gesture steadied her. Grace placed her hand on his arm, feeling the solid strength beneath the fine coat, and nodded. Yes. Their entrance did cause a stir, but not the one Grace had feared. Instead of awkward silence, they were met with genuine welcome. The storekeeper's wife hurried over to greet Grace warmly, exclaiming over how well she looked. The blacksmith called out a hearty hello, reminding her that her wagon wheel still needed repair. The town's matrons drew her into their circle as though she had never been absent, offering plates of food and the latest news. Gabe stayed close, introducing her to the Circle R hands who had come to town for the celebration, many of whom she recognized from their day of work on her homestead. Their respect for Gabe was evident, as was their genuine pleasure in seeing Grace enjoying herself. As the afternoon progressed into evening, lanterns were lit and the musicians struck up livelier tunes. Couples began to claim spaces for dancing, from gray-haired elders to giggling youngsters barely old enough to participate. Would you care to dance, Mrs. Ellis? Gabe asked, a hint of nervousness in his usually confident demeanor. Grace hesitated. Dancing seemed a step beyond social courtesy into something more personal, more meaningful. Yet the music called to her, stirring memories of happier times. I haven't danced in years, she warned. I may have forgotten how. Gabe's smile was gentle. Some things the body remembers even when the mind has set them aside. He led her to the edge of the dancing area, placing one hand respectfully at her waist, holding her right hand in his left. The touch, though proper, sent a current of awareness through Grace. This close, she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, the tiny scar at his temple, the way his lips curved when he smiled. The music swept them into motion, and Grace was surprised to find that Gabe was right. Her feet remembered the steps her mind had forgotten. They moved together with unexpected harmony, turning and stepping in time to the fiddle's melody. Around them, other couples laughed and called to one another, but Grace was aware only of Gabe's steady guidance, the warmth of his hand at her waist, the way his eyes never left her face. You dance beautifully, he said as they circled the floor. As do you, she replied, genuinely impressed by his grace, not what one expects from a cowboy. Gabe's smile turned slightly rueful. My mother insisted all her children learn proper social graces, regardless of our circumstances. Said you never know when you might need to impress someone important. And are you trying to impress me, mister? Roe, the word slipped out before Grace could consider their implications. Gabe's expression grew serious. Yes, Grace, I believe I am. The simple honesty of his answer left Grace breathless in a way that had nothing to do with the exertion of dancing. Before she could formulate a response, the music ended, and they found themselves standing still amid the swirl of couples changing partners and forming new sets. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then someone called Gabe's name, breaking the spell. A Circle R hand approached, apologizing for the interruption but needing a word with his foreman. Excuse me, Gabe said to Grace, his reluctance evident. I'll return shortly. As he stepped away, Grace made her way to the refreshment table, needing a moment to collect her thoughts. The evening had taken an unexpected turn, opening doors she had believed firmly closed. Gabe's admission, so straightforward, so characteristic of the man, had forced her to acknowledge feelings she had been carefully avoiding. She was attracted to Gabriel Rowe. More than that, she respected him, enjoyed his company, valued his friendship. In the months since he had first appeared at her door, he had become important to her in ways she had not permitted anyone to be since John's death. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. To care for someone was to risk loss. Hadn't she learned that lesson already? Yet as she watched Gabe across the gathering, his head bent in conversation, his manner attentive and serious, Grace wondered if perhaps the greater risk lay in refusing to care at all. When Gabe returned to her side, there was a new tension in his bearing. "Grace, I'm afraid we may need to cut the evening short. There's trouble at the north pasture, a report of wolves after the calves." Concern immediately replaced Grace's personal reflections. "Of course you must go." They made their farewells quickly, Gabe apologizing to those who expressed disappointment at their early departure. As they drove back toward Grace's homestead in the gathering darkness, Gabe explained the situation more fully. One of the hands rode in with news that a pack has been seen near the Richardson property line. "With the new calves, we can't risk waiting till morning to strengthen the patrols." "I understand," Grace assured him. "My own calves have been jumpy at night recently. I should have recognized the signs." Gabe glanced at her, concern evident in his expression even in the dim light. "Will you be all right alone? The wolves could just as easily target your herd." The question was practical, not condescending, and Grace considered it as such. "I'll keep the rifle loaded and check the cattle before turning in," she decided. "The barn is secure, and the pasture close enough that I'll hear any disturbance." Gabe nodded, accepting her competence without question. "I'll send one of the hands to check on you tomorrow, just to be safe." When they reached Grace's cabin, Gabe helped her down from the buggy but didn't linger as he usually did. The urgency of the situation at the ranch clearly weighed on him. "Thank you for this evening," Grace said, standing in the pool of lantern light from her porch. "I enjoyed it more than I expected to." "As did I," Gabe replied, his eyes moving over her face as if memorizing it. "I only wish it hadn't been cut short." There was regret in his voice that matched the feeling in Grace's chest. Something had begun between them tonight, something that now had to wait for resolution. "Be careful with those wolves," Grace said softly. "They're most dangerous when they're hungry." "I will," Gabe hesitated, then reached out to take her hand. The touch was brief but deliberate. "Good night, Grace." As she watched him drive away, the buggy disappearing into the darkness, Grace was struck by how quickly her solitary existence had been transformed. Just months ago, she had believed herself content with isolation, convinced that emotional connections were luxuries she could not afford. Now she stood on her porch in a silk dress, her hand still warm from a man's touch, her heart beating with feelings she had thought long buried. "What are you doing, Grace Ellis?" she whispered to herself as she entered the empty cabin. But for the first time in 3 years, the emptiness felt temporary rather than permanent, a condition that might change rather than a sentence to be endured. The next morning dawned clear and hot, promising another scorching summer day. Grace rose early, checking her cattle before the heat became oppressive. All seemed well, with no sign that wolves had approached during the night. Still, she kept her rifle close as she went about her morning chores. By mid-morning, the heat had become intense. Grace was in the garden, harvesting the first of her tomatoes, Gabe's mother's seeds having proven remarkably prolific when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Shading her eyes against the sun, she saw not the Circle R rider she expected but Gabe himself, riding hard toward her cabin. Something in his posture, the urgency of his approach, sent a chill through Grace despite the heat. She set down her basket and walked to meet him as he reined in his lathered horse. "Gabe, what's happened?" He dismounted quickly, his face grave. "Fire in the North Range, started in the dry lightning last night. Wind's pushing it this way fast." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. Fire was every homesteader's nightmare, especially in the summer when the grasslands turned to tinder. "How far?" she asked, practical concerns immediately displacing everything else. "Too close," Gabe answered grimly. "Maybe 3 miles north and moving fast. The men are trying to cut a fire break along the creek, but with this wind," he shook his head, "you need to prepare to evacuate. Gather what you can carry and be ready to ride within the hour." The reality of the situation struck Grace like a physical blow. The homestead she had fought to preserve, the land she had worked with her own hands, the home she had shared with John, all of it could be gone by nightfall. "The cattle," she said, thinking aloud. "I can't leave them." "We'll drive them south toward town," Gabe assured her. "Richardson's men are already helping other homesteaders do the same, but you need to secure whatever valuables you can't replace: papers, keepsakes." His eyes held her steadily. "Don't risk your life for anything that can be rebuilt, Grace." The urgency in his voice cut through her shock. "I understand, I'll be ready." As Gabe rode to check on the cattle, Grace entered her cabin with new eyes, suddenly evaluating everything she owned by a harsh new standard. What could she not bear to lose forever? John's letters tied with faded ribbon, the family Bible with births and deaths recorded inside, the deed to the property, her mother's cameo brooch. A small portrait of her parents taken before she left for the West. These went into a canvas bag, along with a change of clothes and what little money she had saved. Everything else, the furniture John had built, the quilts she had stitched during long winter evenings, the china they had carefully transported across half a continent, all would have to take its chances with the fire. Outside, the smell of smoke had become noticeable, a haze visible on the northern horizon. Grace changed quickly into her riding skirt and secured her most precious possessions. By the time Gabe returned, she was ready, her mare saddled and waiting. "The cattle are moving south," Gabe reported. "Two of Richardson's men are with them. We should follow but keep our distance. Too many hooves stir up dust that makes breathing harder in the smoke." Grace nodded, mounting her mare with practiced ease despite the circumstances. "Will the fire break hold?" Gabe's expression was grim. "We're praying it will. The creek's running low with the summer heat, but they're digging it wider, burning back the grass on this side to create a gap the flames can't jump." They rode south, the smell of smoke growing stronger behind them. Grace refused to look back, keeping her eyes fixed on the trail ahead, but she could feel the heat increasing, hear the distant roar of the fire as it devoured the dry grassland. Other homesteaders joined them on the trail, families driving wagons loaded with hastily packed possessions, ranchers herding cattle and horses. All wore the same expression of grim determination mixed with fear. The fire made equals of everyone, from the wealthiest rancher to the poorest soddy farmer. By late afternoon, they had reached the relative safety of Pine Ridge, where the town had mobilized to receive the refugees. The saloon and church alike had opened their doors, offering water and food to those displaced. Corrals were being improvised to hold livestock, and wagons of supplies were being prepared to support the firefighting efforts. Grace found herself standing in the dusty main street, her mare's reins in one hand, her bag of possessions in the other, suddenly uncertain where to go or what to do. The unreality of the situation washed over her. Hours ago, she had been harvesting tomatoes from her garden. Now she might have no garden, no cabin, nothing but what she carried. "Grace," Gabe appeared through the crowd, his face streaked with soot but his eyes lighting with relief when he saw her. "Thank God. I lost sight of you in all this." "I'm fine," she assured him, though fine seemed a hollow description for her current state. "What news of the fire?" "Still advancing, but slower now." The wind shifted slightly, giving the men more time to widen the fire break. Gabe took the mare's reins from her hand. "Come, the hotel's offering rooms to those who need them. You should rest while you can." Grace wanted to protest that she needed no special treatment, that others had children or elderly family members more deserving of comfort. But the events of the day had drained her more than she realized, and the thought of privacy in which to gather herself was suddenly appealing. The small hotel was already crowded, but the proprietor, a thin man named Miller, recognized Grace and immediately offered her a room. "Mrs. Ellis, please take the corner room upstairs. It's small but private." "No charge, of course." "That's very kind, Mr. Miller, but I can pay my way," Grace began, only to be cut off by the man's emphatic headshake. "Wouldn't hear of it, not in times like these." "Besides," he added with a meaningful glance at Gabe, "any friend of the Circle R is a friend of Pine Ridge. We all remember how they helped when the influenza came through last winter." Grace accepted with as much grace as she could muster, following the proprietor up the narrow stairs to a small but clean room overlooking the main street. Through the window, she could see the activity below as the town continued to organize its response to the fire. "I'll see to your mare," Gabe promised from the doorway, "and bring you news as soon as I have any." "You're going back out there, aren't you?" Grace asked, already knowing the answer. Gabe nodded, his expression serious. Every able body is needed on the fire break, but I'll return by nightfall one way or another. The implication that he would return regardless of the fire's status, that checking on her welfare ranked alongside his duties to the ranch, did not escape Grace's notice. "Be careful," she said simply. After Gabe left, Grace washed away the dust of the journey as best she could with the pitcher and basin provided, then sat on the edge of the narrow bed, suddenly at a loss. The enforced idleness was almost worse than the evacuation had been. At least then she had been acting, making decisions, moving forward. Now there was nothing to do but wait and worry. Unable to remain still, Grace went downstairs to offer her help. The hotel dining room had been transformed into a makeshift aid station, with women preparing food and bandages for the firefighters. Grace joined them, grateful for occupation and the company of others sharing her anxiety. As dusk fell, the first of the men returned from the fire break, exhausted, smoke-blackened figures who collapsed into chairs and accepted water and food with murmured thanks. Grace scanned each group for Gabe but did not see him among them. "Any news?" she asked one of the Circle R hands she recognized. "Fire breaks holding along the creek," the man reported between gulps of water. "But it jumped in one spot near the Wilkins place. They're fighting it there now." The Wilkins homestead was less than a mile from Grace's own property. The knowledge that the fire had come so close sent a fresh wave of fear through her. Night fell and still Gabe did not return. More men arrived, bringing reports of progress and setbacks. The fire had been contained in some areas but continued to advance in others. No one could yet say which homesteads had been spared and which had fallen to the flames. It was nearly midnight when Gabe finally appeared in the doorway of the dining room. His clothes were singed in places, his face blackened with soot, his eyes reddened from smoke. But when he saw Grace, a smile broke through the grime. "It held," he said simply. "The fire break held." Grace felt her knees weaken with relief. She crossed to him, propriety forgotten in the moment. "My place." "Standing," Gabe confirmed. "The fire came within a quarter mile but turned east when the wind shifted. Your land is scorched around the edges, but the cabin and barn are untouched." The news washed over Grace like cool water. Home, she still had a home. "Others weren't so fortunate," Gabe continued, his voice dropping. "3 homesteads north of the creek are gone, the Wilkins place, the Petersons, and Old Man Harker's." Grace closed her eyes briefly, saying a silent prayer for those who had lost everything. When she opened them, she saw the bone-deep exhaustion in Gabe's face. "You need rest," she said firmly, "and food." Too tired to argue, Gabe allowed her to lead him to a chair, bring him a plate of the stew being served, and pour him coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. As he ate, Grace hovered nearby, aware of a protective instinct she had not felt in years. "When can we return home?" she asked when he had finished eating. "Tomorrow, probably," Gabe answered, scrubbing a hand across his face. "They want to be sure no embers reignite with the morning breeze, but the worst is over." Relief made Grace suddenly, acutely aware of how close she had come to losing everything, and how much more it would have meant now than it would have just months ago. Before Gabe had entered her life, the homestead had been simply shelter, a place to exist. Now it represented possibility, a future not merely of survival but of living. "You should sleep," she told him, seeing how he struggled to keep his eyes open. "There's nothing more to be done tonight." Gabe nodded, too exhausted to pretend otherwise. "The men are taking shifts watching for flare-ups. I'm due back at dawn." Grace helped him to his feet, supporting him when he swayed slightly with fatigue. "Come, Mr. Miller said there are cots set up in the back room for the firefighters." As they crossed the dining room, Gabe's hand found hers, his fingers interlacing with her own in a gesture that felt both protective and seeking protection. The touch, simple as it was, communicated something words could not: connection, concern, the acknowledgement that what existed between them had deepened in the crucible of crisis. At the door to the back room where several men already slept on narrow cots, Gabe paused. "Grace," he said quietly, her name a question and a statement both. She met his gaze steadily, reading the emotions there despite the exhaustion clouding his eyes. "I know," she answered, though he had asked nothing aloud. "We'll talk tomorrow, rest now." He nodded, squeezing her hand once before releasing it and disappearing into the darkened room. Grace stood for a moment, her hand still warm from his touch, her heart full of feelings she had not permitted herself for so long. The fire had threatened to take everything she possessed, yet in doing so it had clarified what truly mattered. Not the cabin or the land itself, but what they represented, the possibility of building a life of connection, of a future beyond mere existence. And at the center of that possibility stood Gabriel Rowe, a man who had entered her life during a snowstorm and now stood with her through fire. A man who saw her strength without being threatened by it, who offered help without imposing dependence. As Grace climbed the stairs to her small room, she realized that her long-held belief, that isolation was the price of independence, had been fundamentally challenged. Perhaps true strength lay not in standing alone but in choosing to stand with another, each supporting the other through whatever storms might come. The journey back to her homestead the next day was an emotional one for Grace. As they rode, the landscape told the story of the fire's path, vast swathes of blackened prairie to the north, the sharp line of the firebreak along the creek, and then, miraculously, the untouched grasslands beyond where her property lay. When her cabin came into view, standing solid and unharmed amid the green of her pasture, Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. She blinked them away quickly, unwilling to give in to sentimentality, but the surge of gratitude was overwhelming. "Thank you," she said quietly to Gabe, who rode beside her. He glanced at her, understanding in his eyes. "For what?" "For coming to warn me, for helping me evacuate, she gestured to the undamaged homestead. "For giving me the chance to come back to this." "You don't owe me thanks for that," Gabe replied seriously. "Anyone would have done the same." "But it wasn't anyone," Grace said. "It was you." Their gazes held for a moment, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Then a distant lowing from the pasture broke the spell, her cattle, returned safely and now needing attention. The next few days passed in a flurry of activity as Grace reestablished her routines and assessed what needed to be done after the disruption of the evacuation. The garden had suffered from neglect during her absence, and the cattle were still skittish from their journey, but overall, the homestead had weathered the crisis remarkably well. Gabe came every day, his visits no longer spaced by weeks but becoming a daily constant. He brought news of the fire's aftermath, the community's efforts to help those who had lost homes, the continued vigilance against flare-ups, the assessment of damaged rangeland. More importantly, he brought his steady presence, working alongside Grace without being asked, anticipating needs before she expressed them. They fell into an easy rhythm, moving around each other with the unconscious coordination of dancers who have learned to trust their partner's movements. Yet beneath this practical partnership, something deeper was developing. A tenderness in the way Gabe's hand would steady her as she stepped down from a fence, a warmth in Grace's smile when she brought him water as he worked in the hot sun. Small moments of connection that accumulated like river stones, building something solid and enduring. One evening, as they sat on Grace's porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in gold and crimson, the moment Grace had both anticipated and dreaded finally arrived. "I need to return to regular duties at the Circle R tomorrow," Gabe said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Mr. Richardson has been more than understanding, but the ranch needs its foreman back." Grace nodded, fighting down a sense of loss. "Of course, you've already done far more than anyone could expect." "That's not..." Gabe turned to face her, his expression earnest in the fading light. "Grace, I didn't come here these past days out of obligation. I came because I needed to be sure you were safe." "That you had what you needed." The simple admission hung in the air between them, an opening to a conversation they had been circling for weeks. "I know," Grace said softly. Gabe's hands clasped and unclasped in his lap, a rare display of nervousness from a man usually so contained. "The fire changed things for me," he continued. "Made me realize what matters, what I'm not willing to risk losing." Grace's heart quickened at the intensity in his voice. "What are you saying, Gabe?" "I'm saying that I care for you, Grace Ellis, more than I thought possible, more than I've allowed myself to care for anyone since coming west." The words came steadily, as if he had rehearsed them many times. "I know you've suffered loss. I know you've built a life for yourself that doesn't depend on anyone else. I respect that, admire it even. But I'm asking if there might be room in that life for someone who wants to stand beside you, not in your place." The directness of his declaration took Grace's breath away. There was no artifice in it, no attempt to persuade or pressure, just an honest offering of his heart and a question about her own. "I told myself I would never depend on anyone again after John died," Grace said slowly, gathering her thoughts. "That loving someone meant risking everything, and I couldn't bear to lose everything twice." Gabe nodded, accepting her truth without argument. "But these past months, knowing you," Grace continued, finding courage in his steady gaze. "You've shown me that perhaps I was wrong, that there can be strength in connection, not just vulnerability." She took a deep breath. I care for you too, Gabe, more than I thought possible, more than I've allowed myself to admit until now. The smile that bloomed across Gabe's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual then brilliant, transforming everything it touched. He reached for her hand, his touch gentle but sure. I'm not asking for promises, he said, only permission to court you properly, to see where this feeling between us might lead. Grace looked down at their joined hands, hers smaller but no less were-cruffin than his, both bearing the marks of frontier life. I think, she said carefully, that I would like that very much. In the weeks that followed, Gabe's courtship of Grace became the talk of Pine Ridge and the surrounding homesteads. He came riding in from the Circle R whenever his duties permitted, sometimes bearing small gifts, a book of poetry, a packet of rare seeds, once a length of fine calico he had commissioned from a passing peddler. But more precious than these tokens were the hours they spent together, talking, working, gradually sharing the deeper parts of themselves that they had long kept hidden from others. Grace spoke of her family's rejection when she chose to marry John, of the crushing loneliness after his death, of her determination to prove her own worth by holding onto the land they had claimed together. Gabe told her of his journey west after his father's farm proved too small to support all the children, of his mother's tears when he left, of his promise to establish himself before settling down. I write to her about you, Gabe admitted one evening as they walked along the creek that had saved Grace's property from the fire. She says she already approves of any woman who can make her restless son speak of putting down roots. Grace raised her eyebrows. Is that what you're considering, roots? Gabe stopped walking, turning to face her fully. The summer sunlight caught in his hair, turning it to gold, and his eyes were serious as they met hers. I've been saving for land of my own since I came west, he said. I'd be happy to oblige, Mrs. Ellis. I have quite a few thoughts on the subject. As summer ripened into early autumn, Grace and Gabe's courtship deepened into something neither could deny was love. They spoke of it freely now, no longer dancing around the word or the feeling it described. With that honesty came practical discussions of their future, where they might live, how they might combine their resources, what they hoped to build together. Your land has good water and grazing, Gabe observed as they rode the boundaries of Grace's property one golden September afternoon. With proper management, it could support 3 times the cattle you currently have. The cabin would need expanding, Grace pointed out practically. It's barely large enough for one, let alone. A family, Gabe finished when she trailed off. He smiled at the flush that rose in her cheeks. I'm rather handy with a saw and hammer. And the Circle R hands seem to have taken a liking to you. I suspect they could be persuaded to help raise a proper house come spring. The casual way he spoke of their future together, as if it were a settled matter rather than a distant possibility, filled Grace with both happiness and trepidation. After guarding her heart for so long, the speed with which Gabe had claimed space there was sometimes overwhelming. You seem very certain about all this, she said, pulling her horse to a stop on a rise overlooking the valley. Gabe reined in beside her, his expression growing serious. I am certain about what I feel for you, Grace. The rest, the where and how and when, those are details we'll work out together. He reached across to take her hand. But if you're not ready, if you need more time. It's not that, Grace assured him quickly. It's just after John died, I convinced myself that loving someone was too dangerous, that the price was too high. I built walls around my heart and told myself they were strength, not fear. She met his eyes directly. You've shown me that I was wrong, and I'm grateful for that. But sometimes I wonder if I'm being reckless, rushing toward happiness without considering the cost. Gabe was quiet for a moment, considering her words with the thoughtfulness that was so characteristic of him. My father used to say that love is always a risk, he said finally, but so is crossing a river or planting a crop or driving cattle through unknown country. We take those risks because the potential reward outweighs the danger. His hand tightened gently around hers. What we have, what we could build together, I believe it's worth the risk, but only you can decide if you're ready to take that chance again. The honesty of his response, the respect it showed for her autonomy, confirmed what Grace already knew in her heart. Gabriel Rowe was not John Ellis. He was his own man with his own strengths and flaws. Loving him would not replace what she had lost, but would create something new, equally precious in its own right. I am ready, she said, the words carrying the weight of a vow. I've lived in the shadow of loss long enough. I want to step into the light with you, Gabe. The joy that transformed his face was like nothing Grace had seen before, pure and unguarded, the expression of a man who has found what he has been seeking. Without a word, he dismounted and came to help her down from her horse. When her feet touched the ground, he did not step back but instead drew her gently into his arms. "Grace Ellis," he said, his voice low and fervent. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Though she had anticipated the question, hearing it spoken aloud still sent a shock of joy through Grace's heart. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, I will." Gabe's kiss was gentle at first, a question more than a demand, but when Grace's arms went around his neck in answer, it deepened into something more profound. A promise, a commitment, the beginning of a shared journey. News of their engagement spread quickly through the scattered community. The reactions were universally positive, the Circle R hands slapping Gabe on the back in congratulation, the women of Pine Ridge immediately beginning to plan a proper wedding celebration, Mr. Richardson himself riding out to offer his blessing and a generous wedding gift in the form of additional cattle for their joint herd. The town's planning quite the affair, Gabe reported with amusement after a trip to Pine Ridge for supplies. Mrs. Miller at the hotel is already baking, and the mercantile has ordered special fabric from Helena for the occasion. Grace shook her head in wonder. All this fuss for a quiet widow and a ranch foreman. All this fuss, Gabe corrected, taking her hand, for two people who represent what everyone out here is striving for, a chance to build something that lasts, to find happiness in this hard but beautiful country. Put that way, Grace could understand the community's investment in their happiness. In a land where survival often depended on mutual support, their union symbolized hope, the possibility that the frontier could nurture not just existence but joy. As autumn progressed toward winter, preparations for both the wedding and their future life together accelerated. Gabe began construction on an addition to the cabin that would nearly double its size, with help from Circle R hands on their days off. Grace, with the assistance of women from neighboring homesteads, sewed curtains and quilts for their expanded home. Their wedding date was set for the first week of December, before the worst of winter weather would make travel difficult for guests. Grace found herself caught up in a whirlwind of preparations she had never expected to make again, selecting fabric for a wedding dress, planning a feast for the entire community, arranging for the circuit preacher to officiate. Through it all, Gabe remained her steady center, his quiet confidence and practical nature balancing her occasional moments of overwhelming emotion. When she found herself tearful over memories of her first wedding, he held her without judgment, understanding that her joy in their future did not erase her past. "John will always be part of who you are," he told her one evening as they sat before the fire. "I would never ask you to forget him or what you shared." His generosity of spirit in acknowledging her past love only deepened Grace's certainty about their future together. This was a man who understood that hearts could expand rather than replace, that new love did not diminish what had come before but built upon it. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the first snow of winter having fallen the night before, transforming the landscape into a glistening expanse of white. Grace stood at her bedroom window, watching the sun rise over the pristine valley, thinking of how much had changed since she had watched another sunrise nearly a year before, alone and believing she would always be so. Mrs. Miller and several other women from town arrived early to help her prepare, bringing with them a sense of festive excitement that filled the cabin with laughter and chatter. They helped Grace into her wedding dress, a creation of deep blue silk trimmed with cream lace, chosen to complement her honey blonde hair and fair complexion. "You look absolutely radiant, my dear," Mrs. Miller declared, stepping back to admire the effect. "That young man won't know what hit him." Grace smiled, catching her reflection in the small mirror. The woman who gazed back at her bore little resemblance to the hardened widow who had once been determined to need no one. There was a softness to her features now, a light in her eyes that spoke of hope rekindled and joy rediscovered. The ceremony itself was held in the newly expanded main room of the cabin, which had been decorated with evergreen boughs and red berries gathered from the surrounding hills. Nearly everyone from Pine Ridge and the outlying homesteads had made the journey despite the snow, packing the space until it overflowed onto the porch and yard beyond. When Grace entered on the arm of Mr. Richardson, who had offered to give her away in the absence of her own father, a hush fell over the gathered crowd. But it was Gabe's face she sought among the many, finding him standing before the preacher, tall and handsome in his new suit, his eyes fixed on her with an expression of wonder and devotion that made her heart swell. The preacher's words washed over her, familiar phrases about love and honor, commitment and faith, but Grace found deeper meaning in them now than she had in her first marriage. Then she had been a girl stepping into the unknown with romantic ideas of frontier life. Now she was a woman who had faced the worst the frontier could deliver and emerged stronger, choosing love not despite its risks but with full knowledge of them. When they exchanged vows, Grace's voice was clear and steady. This was no leap into the unknown but a deliberate step forward, eyes open, heart willing. Gabe's hands were warm around hers as they pledged themselves to one another, his voice deep with emotion but unwavering in certainty. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher declared, and the assembled community erupted in cheers and applause that seemed loud enough to reach the distant mountains. Gabe's kiss was gentle but sure, a promise of all that lay ahead. When they turned to face their friends and neighbors as husband and wife, Grace felt a surge of gratitude for this unexpected second chance at happiness. This opportunity to build a life with a man who saw her strength as an asset rather than a challenge. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Grace had experienced since coming west. A true community gathering that spilled from the cabin onto the snowy yard, where bonfires had been built to ward off the cold. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every household, and a small band of local musicians played tunes that soon had couples dancing despite the chill. "Happy, Mrs. Rowe?" Gabe asked as they stood together, watching their guests celebrate. The new name sent a thrill through Grace, not because it represented surrendering her identity, but because it signified their partnership, their shared future. "Very happy, Mr. Rowe," she replied, leaning into his solid warmth, "and grateful." "For what?" "For a snowstorm that brought a shivering cowboy to my door," Grace smiled up at him. "And for being brave enough to let him in." Gabe's arm tightened around her waist. "I'm the grateful one," he said softly, "for a kind widow who saw past her fear to offer a stranger warmth." As the celebration continued around them, Grace marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From isolation to connection, from survival to joy, from believing that strength meant standing alone to understanding that the greatest strength came from standing together. The frontier had taught her hard lessons about loss and endurance, but it had also delivered this unexpected gift. A love that did not diminish her independence but enhanced it, a partner who valued her exactly as she was, a future built on mutual respect and shared dreams. As the winter snow fell gently outside and their friends and neighbors danced and laughed around them, Grace Ellis Rowe knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just shelter but home, not just companionship but love, not just survival but life in its fullest measure. And it had all begun with the simple act of opening a door to a stranger on a snowy night.